Hi all, welcome to educators.com. I'm Harish, software engineer. In this session, we will learn about the inheritance. So basically we'll be learning about the how to inherit the properties as well as methods. So by end of the session, you should be able to understand how we can use the inheritance in JavaScript. Okay, JavaScript is a prototype based language. So all JavaScript objects inherit the properties and methods from their prototype. So whatever be the properties and whatever be the methods you want to inherit, those will be inherited from the proper prototype property of that object. So let's say you created an object and the constructor, and then we have a constructor prototype property where it contains an object. So whatever the objects you create will be inheriting these properties as well as the methods of this prototype property. So the concept of prototyping implies that behavior can be reused by cloning existing objects that serve as prototypes. So here we can clone the existing objects which will be served as prototypes of the newly created objects. Okay, so each object has an internal link to another object called its prototype. Which means, like as I mentioned in before, that we'll be having an object and also a prototype property of that object which will internally contain the properties and methods which will be inherited by the newly created object. So whatever be the inherited properties or methods will be stored in the prototype property. So the object will have an internal link to that prototype property which is actually an object. Okay, so the prototype object has a prototype of its own, and so on until an object is reached with null as its prototype. So each object has a prototype, but prototype is also an object. So since internally even that object also has prototype, so this will continue unless and until the prototype of the last object is null. Why? Because the null object doesn't have its prototype. So that's the reason this chain will continue until it reaches with prototype as null. So whatever be the object you create, it can be used as a prototype of another for another object. Okay, so you can create any number of objects and you can use that object reference for the newly created constructor. Okay, so the JavaScript doesn't have any restrictions for this, and you can use objects like prototype like anything. Okay. So, and one more important thing, like all JavaScript objects inherit from the object or prototype. So as we have a predefined objects like date, array, regular expression, and function in the JavaScript, those will finally inherit from object or prototype. Finally, in the sense, like when you use the state object, it will inherit the properties and methods from date or prototype, and then that will internally inherit from object or prototype. Similarly, array will inherit the properties from array and prototype, array dot prototype, and then that will internally inherit the properties of object or prototype. So this is like a chaining kind of thing. So let's check how we inherit the properties. JavaScript objects have a link to a prototype object. So as I mentioned before, when trying to access a property of an object, the property will be referred from the object, prototype of the object, the prototype of the prototype, and so on. So what does this mean? Let's say we have a created object containing two properties called A and B with values as 1 and 2, and that object name is O. So O dot prototype, you are referring to an object which has a properties of B and C with values of C 3 and 4. Okay, so O dot prototype will point to this object. So finally O object which has the properties of A and B will point internally to the prototype, which is actually an object containing the properties B and C. That will finally point to the null prototype because it doesn't have any prototype itself. Okay, so when you try to access the property, it will first check in the base object. Let's say if you want to find A, it will be first check in the base object, I mean the object, actual object. If it finds, it will return that property. If we okay, let's say we created a C property, we were searching for a C property from this object. If first checks the actual object, if it didn't find, it checks with the prototype. So if it finds in the prototype, it will return that value. Okay, so this is how the chaining goes on. Now coming to inheriting methods. In JavaScript, any function can be added to an object in the form of a property. So as similarly we can add the properties to an object, we can also add function to an object in the form of a property. As here you can check that we declared a details object containing the properties of name and getName. Name will be having the reference to the primitive value called will, and the getName will have a reference to the function which will return the name property value. So when I try to create the new instance, I mean the object of this details prototype, based on this details prototype, it will return me the instance. So when I try to get the name, I mean when I call the getName method, it will return actually the will value, I mean the prototype value. Okay, so when you create this object literal, it is actually the prototype itself. So that's the reason when I call the getName method, it will be referring the name property. Okay, but when you assign the value to the name property, it will be actually creating the name property for this object. Okay, so if you don't use this name property, if you don't use this, declare this line of code, it will be referring to the prototype. If you declare this line of code, it will point to this property. This is actually the prototype shadowing concept. Okay, so when I call this new instance dot get name, it will be referring this Smith value, not the will value. Okay, that's the difference between the prototype reference and actual object property reference. So how to access, if you want to uh, access the property value of this prototype, you can access the using the constructor also. Okay, if you delete this property, I mean like when you new instance dot name equal to Smith, it has created the property of this object. If you delete this property and when you refer this property again, it will be pointing to the prototype itself. Okay, so this is how the chaining goes on. Using classes, ES6 has introduced and many keywords, but most of them currently ES6 is not supported in most of the browsers. But there are some transpilers which will convert this ES6 into ES5 code. Okay, so ES6 has also introduced one of the keyword called classes. I mean for implementing the classes, it has introduced a keyword called class. Although when you check this syntax, I mean the way we are declaring, it looks like similar to how we declare classes in object-oriented programming languages. Okay, but main thing is it is not class based again. I mean, like in JavaScript. This means like when you declare this kind of syntax, don't think that we have declared a class based syntax in the JavaScript. JavaScript remains prototype based. Again, this is just a other form of writing the prototype based code in JavaScript. Okay, so here you can check that we declared a class called polygon with a constructor having the properties called height and width, and then we created a square class which will extend the polygon class. Okay, and inside this we created getters and setters for these properties. Okay, so this syntax is like similar to what we follow in most of the programming languages, I mean object-oriented programming languages. Okay, so this is how we can inherit the properties and methods in JavaScript. Let's flip to brackets IO. So here let's define an object that contains a property called name with the value as will, and then a get name function. That will return this name property. Okay, so let's try to create this one more object based on this prototype using the object dot create method. Okay, create of details, and then let's try to check whether this property values are inherited for this new instance or not. So here you can check that it has printed the value will because it has inherited the properties from the prototype of details object. So now when we define or overwrite the property, which is like creating the property for that object. So till now when we before this line it is referring the property of the prototype. When we define this line, it will be adding the new property called name to this new instance. So with this the prototype property will be shadowed. So this is called prototype shadowing. This means like if there are properties with the same name at the object level and also at the prototype level, the object level property will take the precedence over the prototype level property. Okay, so now let's try to print this name value. Name, sorry, new instance dot get name. So here you can check that it has written the value Smith, which is a object property. So this is a difference of how you can use the prototype property as well as the object properties, and apart from that how to inherit the methods and properties from an object prototype. Okay, so that's all from this session. Thank you.